Thula is an associate professor, currently based at the University of Pretoria. His earlier research focused on the ANC's liberation struggle, and his first book, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC's Armed Struggle, was published by Penguin in 2016. As many of us know, this was a groundbreaking book, which we still set for our students, incredibly rich in its empirical reach and its kind of analytic implications. And yes, so I think that's all that I really want to say. Thula will be speaking about his latest book, which is hot off the press, which is called The History of South Africa from 1902 to the present. So Thula will speak for about 30 minutes, and then there will be Q&A. To keep things streamlined in terms of bandwidth and so on, and background noise, please do mute your microphone and stop video until the end of Thula's talk. And then please only unmute and start the video when you would like to ask a question. So without further ado, Thula.
Thank you, Mandisa, and good afternoon to the colleagues at UCT and perhaps from beyond. My book had its origins towards the end of 2014. The mid-2010s was a time when it was impossible not to notice a curious unrest in contemporary developments in South Africa and a quickening accumulation of social, political, and economic stress in the country. This had potential historiographical significance, given that the country's post-apartheid identity had been defined to a considerable extent by the desire to escape what had come before, whether by treating the past as a storehouse of never to be repeated mistakes, wrongs to be redressed, divisions to be reconciled, or traumas to be healed. Now, implicit in this attitude towards the past is the confidence that everything worth assimilating from it had been absorbed into present understandings. In other words, our present understanding of the past provides a sufficient basis to heal those wounds, redress those injustices, reconcile those divides, etc. Now, this feeling was sufficiently widespread that many raised the question about whether the history of South Africa remained a worthwhile field of study at all. The present juncture in the 2010s raised the question about whether our existing base of samples and parallels from the past was sufficiently wide and whether we were extracting the right lessons from those past, and it provided a basis for reinterpretation. My previous research for the book on MK suggested an empirical basis on which such a reevaluation could be provided. First, that book was based overwhelmingly on records that only became available after apartheid. Now, it offered, obviously, with regards to being focused on the ANC's rise to power, information that could explain the origins of many aspects of the post-apartheid juncture. But beyond the ANC, the research also involves doing general research on previous periods of South African history, and that pointed to similar episodes in the past, many now forgotten and obscure, that previous generations have faced. Now, this highlights an additional aspect with regards to reading the past, which is simply that post-1994 developments offer a new vantage point from which to consider the longer-term significance of past events. In other words, we know more about the consequences of previous episodes, and it provides a basis for rereading and reinterpreting what had come before. Naturally, the subject matter of the earlier book limited me to those aspects of the records that touched on the ANC's armed struggle, but it also made me aware that there was the basis for a broader book. But it also made me clear that there was a basis for a book that would not only engage the new archives, but also access the archives of the earlier periods on the basis of the kind of reinterpretation that I've spoken about. And being based in Pretoria at the center of many of the most important of those records offered a good basis for undertaking that work, which would also build on the previous work. All of these factors are part of the ingredients about, you know, when you do a research for a book, is it a viable project? Is it a necessary and needed project? And these were all parts of the mix in terms of deciding my thoughts on these questions. In terms of the contents, there's three main criteria that guided my decisions on what to include and exclude. The first and most important is the assumption that any historical book must account for change over time. That involves using sources contemporary to past generations in order to try and enter into the life of those previous periods and access what they consider to be the most pressing problems of their experience, and to avoid taking present-day definitions of the terms South Africa and South Africans for granted. In other words, not to project the present onto the past and to understand the past in its own right. This approach was based on the understanding, as I've put it in the preface to the book, that each generation chooses its heroes for the time in which it lives and can only be fairly judged on the knowledge available to it. But as I added in the preface, in choosing its heroes, each generation reappraises the past, by which I'm merely referring to the recurrent phenomenon of the outcasts and dissidents of one generation becoming the prophets and martyrs of the next generation. This therefore involves considering events not just in terms of their immediate significance for contemporaries, but also in terms of their longer term significance for later generations, and accounting for the factors in play in these shifting appraisals. But there was a third dimension which touches on the issues with which I began this presentation, namely that, as the book suggests, the work extends, quote unquote, to the present, according to the subtitle of the book. Now, this involves considering events that we, all of us have lived through, witnessed, even participated in. And contemporary history places the present generation in the position of its predecessors in terms of trying to obtain knowledge from the past that will enable us to interpret present day debates and challenges in terms of their future significance. In terms of balance, the post-apartheid period fills about a third of the book. It reflects the fact that I wanted these three elements of significance to appear as distinct, separable features in the book, but importantly and significantly, there is an ineradicable element of overlap between them. The changing relationship between the past and the present is reflected in the fact that we do always have these reevaluations of the past, means that the definition of relevance is ever changing. And a consequence of this is that what should be considered to be antiquarian and what should be considered to be living in the past and in history is in constant flux. A good illustration of what I mean will I think be provided by referring to Eric Walker's History of South Africa, first published in 1928. In that work, he identifies the most important factor in the country's history since its unification in 1910 as being the shifting relationship between black and white labor. Now, significantly within that framing, the Spanish flu of 1918 merited not a single mention. I would argue that his focus was perfectly justified and his interpretation is not incorrect for that omission, and I would base that judgment on the issues that were uppermost at the time that he wrote. To provide further support for this view and for his interpretation, if we look at the liberal and radical histories that were produced over the next few generations, they focused in their different ways on aspects of South African social and economic history. The Afrikaner nationalist historiography had a different orientation, perfectly relevant to and resonant to the contemporary times in which they wrote, but their focus was not on public health. Clearly, however, a history written in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis would need to reconsider this omission and revive from the dead past certain precursors and parallels that were of most pressing urgency to those who lived through them, literally life and death importance, but which subsequently fell into relative obscurity. There's nothing wrong with the interpretation provided by people who did not center that episode in the past, because the Spanish flu simply disappeared and the country focused on dealing with the social and economic fallout from the Great War, if we're speaking about the 1920s, in which Eric Walker wrote. Now, this raises a point of larger historiographical importance. Briefly put, a naturalistic account of human history that reduces nature to means of production is not an adequate one. Nature enters into history in many other ways and with no less profound consequences, as the history of the Spanish flu, COVID-19, the Black Death, smallpox, and HIV/AIDS indicates. Contemporary engagements regarding the dangers of climate change and the Anthropocene highlight another important category. Now, judging the past when you know the outcome and previous generations didn't is by my interpretation, a fairly unimportant, uninteresting task. In the present, when you're in the hot seat and working with unpredictable outcomes, that is the true cockpit of judgment, and that's where judgment becomes important, when you're in the hot seat and providing the interpretations of longer-term history. Now, in the context of this book, the present was actually a 7-year period, because obviously that's the process from the gestation of the book to the completion. And in the process, many events that once lay in the future have now become part of a quite distant past. And included in this, at the time when I started research from the book, the Fees Must Fall protests, for example, lay in the future. And for a while, the text ended with a bullet point that was titled Bell Pottinger. That was terra incognito. But these are all parts of what now seems to be a long-lost pre-COVID world. A constant theme throughout, as the country has moved through these processes, is that the country is entering into quote unquote uncharted terrain. One of the challenges of the book is to explore whether this is necessarily the case. If it was uncharted terrain, we would constantly be looking for precursors to try and explain what we're going through, and constantly adjusting verdicts based on unforeseen outcomes. But I found that this is that this is on the whole not the case, that the waters through which we travel are fairly well navigated. Approaching the events of the present, having traveled from 1902, reveals certain new elements, very significantly new forms of organization and mobilization, which are facilitated by contemporary technology. But in terms of the ideological orientation of many of these movements, they are consciously invoking longer-term traditions and precursors from the past. One of the challenges in the book is to try and account for, if you're going to focus and center events, how these can collectively function to define the epochs, the eras by which we understand South African history. Now, my input regarding this I would explain or introduce by referring to a feature of the archives. Now, it's true that the archives reflect the ideology of the individuals, groups, and organizations who are responsible for creating them. But it's also no less true that their content focuses on grappling with problems, crises, and challenges that defy these ideological frames. By my reading, that's the central tension in any archive: preconceptions, biases, prejudices, and interests which clash against something which is pushing back. Now, sometimes the recalcitrant facts can be shaped into conformity with preconceived ideology, though always after a struggle that sees the two modify each other. But sometimes the ideas have to succumb to the effect, and the end of apartheid offers an iconic example of what I'm speaking about in this regard. By the late 1970s, there were too many teething problems, challenges, troublesome individuals, economic developments which were not conforming to ideology for the system, for it to be ignored by the policymakers in Pretoria. So we had the initiation of an era of reform to try and stave off the crisis. The failure of reform meant that by the late 1980s, the debate in the country had moved beyond reforming this or that law to considering or reconsidering the principles that inform the laws, a more fundamental process, which touches on ideology, conception, and belief. F.W. de Klerk once put it that South African society had become like a scrambled egg, and you can't unscramble an egg in the way that the architects of apartheid had tried to do with their segregation policy. When we consider the factors that ended apartheid, sanctions, boycotts, mass struggle, and armed struggle undoubtedly played a role, but of all the causes, one which is undoubtedly significant is the simple exhaustion of trying to fit square pegs into round holes, the futility of that process. Now, apartheid therefore ended to a significant degree based on ideological defeat born of political exhaustion that preceded the final collapse of that system. The transition from apartheid also shows that many problems are simply solved with the adoption of a different point of view. Apartheid was endlessly generating problems and puzzles which simply disappear if you adopt a new vantage point, a new frame of reference. Many of the most implacable questions and conflicts simply disappeared post-1994. This is a genuine liberation, including of energy and resources, to try and focus on other problems. But other challenges have simply proven more intractable and could not be resolved by the mere adoption of an anti-apartheid framework. By the interpretation of my book, the outlines of many of these problems are discernible in the first 100 days of the new era. I won't go into the detail of these immediate post-apartheid contestations, but many of them resolve to the point which many pointed out, that part of the legacy of apartheid is that South Africa emerges from the experience as a middle-income country. The potential explosiveness of this reality of South Africa's place in the world is very soon showed on the country's borders, with a surge of migration from countries which are genuinely poor. And we begin to see the origins of issues that will subsequently become chronic. No later than January, the early months of 1995, we see the frog marching of foreigners to police stations, with them being accused of stealing jobs. As people pointed out at the time, all policies, whether they're related to trade, labor relations, or migration, have to take account of this reality at the risk of catastrophic policy failures. Now, implied in what I've said is that many of the problems that can be solved with the adoption of a new framework simply are resolved with the adoption of that framework, and those which aren't will not be. Those other issues will fester, they will metastasize, and they will become the basis of crisis. There's nothing melodramatic about this. The constant tension between ideas and facts is one which is faced by every society at literally every stage of history. The opposing idea, which is the foundation of every teleological account, that a point might arrive at which history comes to a definitive end, and this process will cease. An underlying thesis of my book is an unremarkable one, that the South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, is subject to the same process of attrition as every other society, and there's no good reason to believe that the end of apartheid ended South African history. What I'm saying is now much more commonplace than it might have been in the 2010s. The idea that South Africa is posed for a fundamental realignment on a par with those that were achieved at the beginning, middle, and the end of the 20th century is to say nothing that is being said by others in different fields and different vantage points. What I'm doing is putting the same ideas into a more historiographical frame of reference. One of the most striking differences in the short period of time since the publication of the book in October, although for me the end of the process came in mid-August when I signed off on it and it went through to the printers, is that to a large extent the ideas that founded the book have ceased to be prophecy. If the era since 1994 can be defined as the post-apartheid era, what we see from the vantage point of the end of 2021 with that approaching is that certainly in the political terrain, but also in terms of the mood of the country and the present status quo in terms of policy debates, we've probably already entered into the post-apartheid era. I've been very economical with my time. That's my presentation. It's done in less than 20 minutes. I've been conservative with 30 minutes, but that's the presentation over. Thank you very much for providing an audience for this presentation.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we will not be having a formal discussion, so please do pose questions for Thula. Thula, I'm fine with getting the ball rolling, seeing as no one else is stepping into the breach.
Okay.
Conversations recently in Pretoria, I'm really interested in the fact that you are foregrounding the history of medicine much more, particularly at this current conjuncture where our lives are being so dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And your point about Walker's book published in the 20s not having mentioned Spanish flu, that chimes quite well with Howard Phillips' research, which also shows that there was kind of loss of social memory of the Spanish flu shortly thereafter. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which also follows on from our various engagements, is I think your interest in the history of medicine demonstrates that you're interested in politics with a small p, not simply party politics. And I'm wondering if and how your work engages with women's history or the history of sexuality, both of which are completely pertinent to the history of AIDS, which, was a pandemic we've lived with for a much longer period of time in South Africa.
Well, I'm interested in the history of medicine, to a significant extent because, well, it's part of the pressing problems of previous generations, but I'm not following every obsession which previous generations had. If you go through the past, there are many political initiatives which contemporaries thought were very interesting, but which simply disappeared. And there's always that tension, even though this was considered to be extremely important by the people who lived through them, they're not necessarily interesting to us. So there's this contest between us and them. It's interesting to them, should we include it? Now, episodes like HIV/AIDS are very important and they need to be concluded in their own right because they're very important from the history of the 1990s. They can't be dismissed like certain obsessions and fads which were there at the time. But the point I was raising with regards to Walker is that I don't think he was unjustified writing from the context of the post-Rand Revolt period to say these are the issues which are uppermost understanding South Africa as a society, social and economic history and the fallout to that. I'm interested in the Spanish flu. I had a small portion of it, which became a much larger portion of it, because it's relevant to the juncture that we entered to as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And there are relevant aspects of the response to Spanish flu which have a bearing on the present. So that is what, in terms of deciding what to include, elevated that important life and death issue from the second decade of the 20th century into something which is much more elastic. So there's that constant tension between us and them. I've got to sometimes include what previous generations considered to be important, but that sometimes you have to veto what they considered to be important. You know, in the late 1960s, when it becomes clear that apartheid is not going to work in the ways that the founders of apartheid considered it was, there are all sorts of small-scale interventions and experiments in different ways of being South Africa. Most of them completely disappear from consciousness. People thought it was very important at the time. For example, the Hillbrow drug scene, and you'd have in the conservative Afrikaans newspapers how this has to be smashed, and you have these conflicts between University of Pretoria and University of the Witwatersrand students on the end, you know, on the old Johannesburg Road, where you've got the long hairs and the short hairs fighting with each other. They don't feature in the book, not because they're not very interesting, and they might become interesting in the future, but I have to veto them as issues. With regards to women's history, I mean, that's a perennial feature of the book. Obviously, the iconic major events such as the Women's March of the 1950s, but also the Women's Charter during the decade are concerned. But women's history is South African history, so it's not in a box which is titled Women's History. You've got women throughout the book, from Mary Fitzgerald to Lillian Ngoyi and all of the other major figures who appear in terms of their contribution and their intervention in the larger history of South Africa.
Great that we're talking about gender mainstreaming in our discipline and that we're not interested in just add women stir, you know. So that's really great that you're adopting that approach. Carolyn, did I see a hand from you?
You did, Mandisa, and I'm slightly embarrassed to ask my question for two reasons. One is that I was forced to come in later than I would have liked to have, and I haven't had a chance to read the book. I suppose that's in the nature of an event like this, and I want to ask a question. And if I'm remiss in asking it because you've already dealt with it, then just say so. But it's one that interests me very much, and I'd love the opportunity to put it to you. When you do a big book like this with a big title like that, you take on a big thing. The matter of how the author, you, are thinking about periodization is of great interest to the reader, me. And so I'm interested in drawing you on the question of periodization and just in general your thoughts on periodization and what it is to take on a big swatch of time like that and rethink the periodization.
Yeah. Well, in the end, at the beginning, there were three main boxes that I had, and one of them was apartheid, one of them was post-apartheid, and one was what had become before, and I wanted to look at the relations between them. What we have are 31 chapters in which those different periods are broken up into smaller sections of time. Firstly, the chapters I had at one stage were simply too long. They have to be brought down into a much more digestible period. And so within these large eras, you have certain demarcation points. So for example, the first chapter would be the end of the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War, until the beginning of the process towards unification. That's purely arbitrary. It could have gone all the way until the union in 1910, but in terms of space and making sure that there's proportionality between the chapters, that's the division which worked best. To a certain extent, those decisions are created by the considerations that I'm sort of raising in this answer, but the major thing coming into the book was the major ideas I had in my mind. I literally had a title, History of South Africa. The research is a beginning of a process of finding material and seeing what kind of content can I inform into that with these considerations that I discussed in my presentation, which is wanting to discuss the past in its own right, why you have these changes, why you have the movement from one era to another, what explains the shifting definitions of what each generation considers to be its most important, but also using the past to interpret the present as well. Those are the three major considerations that I had. So with this history of South Africa, which is taken from the founders of the discipline of South African historiography, the Walkers and Thiels in the early 19th century, and seeing what would a history written from the perspective of the 21st century, with our differing preconceptions, how would we do it differently? And the research process is an adventure of trying to find out more information and seeing how you would do it yourself. And so all of the decisions about how to organize the chapters were informed by that. And those were the factors that guided me in my process.
Do we have other questions? Well, I have another one. Really trying to, I was wondering, is something that you explored at MK is the issue of kind of globalization, transnational processes, global history, global solidarity. And I know that's something you're also very interested in at the moment. Are there any general trends you see or changes in terms of, because obviously if we think about what South Africa is or what a state is, it's not just internal, it's also about the international community. So are there any particular shifts that you think were quite important or new global phenomena that you explored?
Yeah, I mean, South Africa's integration into transnational networks is not something that has to be forced as a sort of distinctive turn that you're doing. It's in front of you all the time. I mean, the formation of the country is literally as part of an imperial project, and the struggle against segregation and apartheid is a process which drew in a uniquely diverse range of international actors who wanted to intervene, not just in the solidarity movement, but also militarily. So there's large sections about the so-called border war, and that touches on a different aspect, which is that the history of South Africa is also the history of South Africa as a colonial power, but also as a power which tried to expand, but failed to expand ultimately beyond its 1910 borders. So I found that to be, you know, it's more forced not to integrate that. And you have to be more determined ideologically to try and keep that out than to keep it in. So following the evidence where it leads you involves, as far as South African history is concerned, definitely taking integrating trends, ideas, individuals who come from outside South Africa's borders and influence internal developments, whilst also not forgetting also that South Africa is also pushed back in different directions in terms of methods of struggle, systems of rule. It's been tremendously fertile in terms of the conflicts have given South Africa a very violent history, but in terms of innovation in that realm, in terms of struggle, resistance, domination, there are many initiatives in South Africa which outsiders have found to be worthy of import from us.
Do we have further questions? Any further questions? Joanne.
Hi, thank you very much, Thula. I have not read the book either, but I do have a copy sitting on my desk. And I just had a simple question. I found your history of MK very compelling because of the way in which you, or the tense in which you wrote it. It really read quite racily and very easily. And I want to know, A, if you've adopted a similar approach in this new work, or whether the subject matter required a different approach, and also the degree to which your sources might have differed and your approach to those sources might have influenced the tense which you used to write the book. I know that MK, you drew on a lot of news reports, and that sort of gave a very present sense to the narrative. And I want to know how you might have thought differently writing your work that spanned a much longer history. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for that. It's good. It's a very there's a fundamental difference between the two. I think that as far as MK is concerned, one of the considerations there was to give justice to what Joe Slovo once one of his favorite quotes was, "You only win once, and that's at the end." And what he was referring to then was that there's a whole series of abortive missions, false starts, initiatives that seem promising but they run aground, and the accumulation of those is the armed struggle. And by adopting a strictly chronological approach, it's about avoiding avoiding a narrative in which any particular process races through to its conclusion, because that's not how it unfolded. That doesn't explain the geographical dispersion and the extremely long, protracted duration of that conflict. And it allows you to include all of those, what might seem to be innocuous beginnings, but as a reader, if I'm including them, you must have the sense that they're part of this larger story and trying to proceed in that way. With regards to the history that I've written, there's a much different narrative task. Firstly, with regards to incorporating everything for simply practical reasons, and a large number of the authorial decisions are based on practicality. You're not going to be able to, for reasons that I've mentioned when I spoke about simply ignoring stuff which were the subject of very heated debate in previous generations, you're not going to be able to incorporate all of these dead ends, these lost causes, and fit in a 600-page book. So this is really focusing on the major episodes which created irreversible change. And what I mean by that is aspects which become the foundation of the next chapter in the country's history. So this is really the major events. There's actually a series which was broadcast around the time that I started the book, and it's accessible if you're determined enough, on National Geographic. It's called The 80s, The Decade That Made Us. And what that involves is taking these seminal events during the 1980s, having been brought up in the 1980s, you remember all of them, all of these major episodes which shaped the world as we know it today. Now, I considered my task in a sense to be looking at the 120-year period covered in the book and looking at these major episodes. And that's a slightly different narrative task. And so this is much more focused on major events. There are only a few moments in the history of MK where all of these convergent strands accumulate into major moments of conflict and crisis. I mean, the Wankie and Sipililo campaigns in the late 60s is one such example of that. But those are relatively rare because it's so geographically dispersed with such small units that you don't have these large-scale clashes and military battles. The history of South Africa that I've just written is basically all of that, all major blow-ups in the society which account for the society's development from 1902 until the present.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Thula, for some time you've been really interested in challenging nationalist accounts of South African history, so African and Afrikaner nationalist accounts of South African history. Is that something that you do in the book?
There is a version of my presentation which contained what I really wanted to say, but I never was able to get it down on paper in time, and so it wasn't part of the presentation. So I'm going to risk it here, and it might flop, but at least you'll have the entertainment value of that. Now, one of the chief preoccupations in the literature has been to try and find a central theme in South African history, and the debate amongst the leading historians has been to try and account for what that central theme will be. Cooperation, class conflict, nationalism, whether Afrikaner or African, are some of the candidates which have been proposed. And there's been this idea that these are rivals to each other with regards to providing a framework for the unfolding of the South African past. Now, going through these debates, as I have done as part of a different project, I think what is interesting about them ultimately, and potentially of the greatest historiographical significance, is that the advantage has definitely been on the side of those who fought on the defensive. In other words, each of those, in holding their own, they've been able to hold their own by showing that their chosen candidate for the central theme has been one that has played an ever-present role in the country's history, and it's influenced developments elsewhere. But I think that that's had the important consequence, the successes that people have had fighting on the defensive has had the important consequence that none of them have succeeded in their offensive task of driving all of the others from the field. And I think that what that suggests historiographically is that rather than trying to advance by exclusion in terms of eliminating every single rival, is that you have to consider the possibility that ultimately, in the final arrangement, you'll have to go for an interpretation which sees the history of South Africa in terms of the interaction between these ever-present themes. We speak of apartheid as being a system, but that would involve seeing every dispensation, every period of South Africa as being a system which rests on the equilibrium between these different elements, how they balance each other, how they contend with each other. Sometimes it's an unstable equilibrium because they're in conflict with each other. Events, as I would interpret them, involves the different strands of South African history coming into contest with each other. And the kind of realignments that I spoke about would be when the equilibrium between them is broken, the balance shifts. So under that interpretation, you would be able to find if you look at any of these themes in isolation, you can identify them as being a central theme. But as you look at how they clash with each other, you'll see how those central themes were halted, deflected, or reversed. That's been the case with every single one of these candidates, which has been proposed as the central theme. And what I'm trying to do, or how I would consciously view myself, as there's this idea that if you're not identifying a central theme, you haven't, you're lacking the depth of explanation which is supposedly provided by those who have tried to do so. It's not that, I would say, it's not that we're lacking a philosophy, it's that we don't agree with that other philosophy. We're trying to explain things in a different way. So what I've literally tried to do, and it's related to how I explain it in the preface, I tried to have a pithy opening line, and that's how the preface is introduced. But then immediately from the second paragraph of the preface, emphasizing that I will try and not try to reduce or straighten South African history to any one particular theme, but try and explain it in terms of nothing being excluded from the framework of analysis which can explain how we get to where we are today. That involves not excluding military history, not excluding high politics, not excluding nationalism, because these are important themes which help to shape the trajectory of the country, including public health, of course, as we've mentioned, women's history, gender history, with the principles of what is excluded and what is excluded being the criteria which I tried to outline in my presentation.
Are there further questions? Sean.
Thanks, Thula, for a great presentation, and I haven't read the book. Maybe this is an unfair question. I understand what you're trying to do in this book. It's a very particular project, but I'm speaking as a sort of historian of violence, particularly at a local level. But I'm curious to know, and I understand you can only put so much into a 600-page book, I mean, it really is not a criticism. But I'm very, given that you're, as you said in one of your responses, that you focus on lots of particular violent events, right, in order to construct this narrative. But I'm curious just to know how you think about, other kinds of violence. which has been there, what some might call systemic violence or slow violence, like Rob Nixon's term, but the kind of violence that has been there since colonialism and has been reproduced in all sorts of cyclical ways into our cities and into our rural areas. And particularly, I suppose, the example that I'm thinking of is, so for example, in Cape Town, I'm sure there's various examples of this around the country, but it's how citizens of the city deal with spatial injustice. You know, I mean, I'm curious to see how do you understand spatial injustice that is prolonged over many generations? What's your thinking about things like that, for example?
It is clear, it is centrally implicated in the history of segregation and apartheid, and the malign neglect, the omission of certain policies, who counts with regards to the archives, and the design of policies, if we speak about apartheid, which are consciously, you know, it's going to have a disproportionate effect, despite the rhetoric of trying to find justice and separation. These are such central aspects of South African reality. They cannot but be a central part of the narrative, the design. So if I speak about my initial framing categories as being apartheid, post-apartheid, and segregation, for want of a better word, before, the policy making environment that you speak of, the design of these policies, these are all central aspects, which are, but there's such overlap between them. When you speak about these periodic explosions, which you have in South African history, where people can no longer endure the circumstances under which they're living, there's a long paper trail, which comes often to some bureaucrat who thought that there was something which could pass without being. They all overlap and interact. I wouldn't, again, as in the same way as women's history is part of South African history. Yeah. When insurrection, rebellion occurs in South African history, it is part of these processes which you're referring to. An explanation in those terms is something that I consciously try to do. Just like to say that nobody's my editor has read the book, and I think Keith Gottschalk has sort of read the book. He's produced an instant review. Nobody else has read the book.
Okay. Good luck.
I saw two other hands raised. I'm not sure if they're still raised. Maybe you could put it in the chat box, just like raised hand, or just unmute. If you have a question. Anyone? Well, Thula, just because Sean was speaking just now, I had a little thought, which is, how does your work engage with oral history? So an issue that we have is there are biases and gaps and silences in the archives, particularly as regards Black perspectives and experiences. How did you kind of navigate, or how do you deal with this issue?
By saying thank you very much to all of the people who've tried to address that, because what we have is a cumulative consequence of all of the initiatives which have been taken, which have occurred over many years, is the integration into the archive of what is now quite a large basis of oral history. I use oral history as a source alongside to be, in very much the sense in which my UP colleague Charles Van Onselen was criticized for using them as being another basis of testable information, which can be used alongside other surviving remnants of the past to try and get an accurate picture. My approach to oral history, I did not conduct oral history myself because so much has been done by others, and it's a work enough to be able to go through all of that. So if you look at all the various repositories and databases which have been found, it seems as though almost every archive has more than one collection, oral history collection of its own. And so treating those oral history records as a part of the archive like any other. For all the limitations and of what that approach might be, that was my approach to it.
And in our department, History Access, a central concern has been having a more systematic and in-depth kind of effort and push for dealing with African vernacular language sources. I think going forward, you know, that will be work that will be tremendously useful for us to engage with. Other questions?
If there are no more questions, there are no more questions.
I have one final one.
Okay.
But we can also talk about it, you know, when hopefully we may be able to safely see each other again, or even remotely. Which is, okay, so I'm really interested in global history, as you can see. What's two questions? One is, do you have any ideas about how we can decolonize global history? So what you find in a lot of global history journals, it also filters down sometimes, unfortunately, to undergraduate textbooks. Do you think your work speaks to kind of asserting the important role of Africa in global history, and tries to decolonize it? And then there's a much more basic point, which is who you deem to be the audience for your work. Is it aimed at undergraduate students, postgraduate students, researchers, general audiences? Because I think that something that many of us struggle with is to find accessible readings to teach about South African history. And it seems to me that your work might offer a contribution in that regard.
With regards to audience, I'll take whatever I can get. So I'm happy for as wide an audience as possible, and it's tried to be written in a sense that it's going to be as accessible as possible. With regards to global history, I mean, how do we decolonize it? By asserting the fundamental truth that the world history is not the history of colonialism. I mean, colonialism and Western colonialism is an important part, but there are many other points of connection between them. I mean, as an empirically based historian, sometimes, you know, I sometimes struggle to put into theoretical frames what is standing there before you. I mean, if we're speaking about anti-colonial perspectives with regards to decolonized perspectives, I mean, amongst the other candidates are international solidarity, Fidel Castro deciding to send his best troops to participate in the liberation of South Africa, the influence, for example, of the Bolshevik Revolution affecting the trajectory of South Africa's internal political development, the sanctions movement of the 1980s, the inspiration which African politics receives from developments in the rest of the continent during the 50s, with Mau Mau, Ghana's independence, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all of this is there. It could be theorized, but I think that, you know, in terms of looking at the factors which set South Africa's trajectory over the course of the period, then a decolonial approach to world history is clearly a part of it. Mandisa, you're muted, I think.
So I see in the chat that Carolyn's written the aspect that I find most exciting about Thula's work is the way in which he combines attention to the historiography produced over time and his own production of historical accounts. Do you want to respond to that, or?
These are very kind words. I'm happy to hear that the Umkhonto Sizwe book is being prescribed. I'm not sure what the students would make of it, but I'm always I'm genuinely grateful for the kind words which are extended by colleagues, and thank you very much for that.
And I think what's really ambitious and important about your work is the fact that you engage with Pan-Africanism and also Afro-cosmopolitanism. And I think given the Afrophobia that we see in our own society, it's very worth revisiting, you know, that history. But like, how do you get sources to kind of get at those sorts of histories? Because unfortunately, in an African context, there's often archives are not always well maintained, the resource constraints. So, you know, what were some useful approaches that you found to access sources dealing with that history?
The Botswana archives are better curated than our own, and so are the Zambian archives. So that was a pleasure to go through all those. With regards to when you go into the individual archives, I mean, they're staring at you. I mean, let's look at John Dube's statement. He wasn't at the ANC's founding conference in January 1912, but he wrote a thanks letter to members of the organization. I mean, inter alia there, he identifies himself as being a native. He also identifies himself as being a disciple of Booker T. Washington, but he also defines himself as being a proud member of the British Empire. And if you look at his career, you see all of those identities, native, Negro, and imperial citizen, influencing his response to political developments. And I think that's why it's important, I think, to avoid telescoping the present onto the past. If you adopt the straightening approach where everything in the past is inexorably leading on to present day understandings, you miss some of that nuance and also some of the understandings which they had, which we might lack, and which could also help to illuminate the present. I think that's an important way. I think that's why I foregrounded that in my presentation, because I think it's these are such what people often dismiss as antiquarian history. The point I was trying to make is it's antiquarian for one particular point in South Africa's one particular present, but all of these diverse meanings of South African identity and South Africa as a country, they inevitably come back into life. And I think it's important to, one of the reasons why archives are important is because they're repositories where we can access them. And I think it's through that way that history has a continuing relevance in what are basically constantly changing circumstances. So basically my presentation was about trying to articulate that, because I think it's the central point of what my book is trying to contribute. And reading South African history, or the way that I read South African history, or I've tried to read South African history, is precisely in those terms. That's what the book contributes.
So are you therefore saying that there's records that have been, you know, we've talked about so-called hiding in plain sight, that we just need to recover, kind of have a way of having joined up thinking? Because that's sort of also what you were saying about the Zambian and Botswanan archives also goes against the stereotype that that most archives in Africa are poorly kept, because you're saying there are examples where there is, excellence. So that I found very interesting.
Now, our national archives are poorly kept. I mean, as part of doing a general history, I tried to do a clean sweep. 10% they can't retrieve. Sorry, I mean, the people at the Botswana and the Zambian archives are better at their job.
So in terms of what you were saying around, by the way, time is getting tight, but there is time for more questions or comments. So please do feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. But I was wondering too, there's something we talk about a lot in our department is the situation as regards the teaching of history, at the level of basic education, and then also kind of popular education about history. do you see how your work could kind of, contribute to those efforts, or sort of mesh in some way with kind of popularizing new accounts?
Amongst all of the strands which contributed to the book, I think that one of them was teaching the rise and fall of segregation and apartheid, and dealing with post-apartheid generations of students who say, well, this might have had relevance at one stage, but it's not necessarily relevant to our experience. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important, to me, in writing the history, to make sure that we deal with the post-apartheid period in similar depth and detail to the way that we've traditionally dealt with apartheid and segregation before it. Now, with regards to the classroom environment, I think it's what you make of it. I think that these are live issues, and some people would retreat from the sort of live atmosphere in many of the classes as far as the teaching of South African history is concerned. But people come in there with legitimate questions, strong beliefs, preconceptions, which are often wrong, on very simplistic accounts of apartheid. I tried to insert it in there as a provocation with regards to thinking about the legacy as not being simple. People have not responded to it so far, that it's a mixed legacy. It can't just, if you limit yourself to a propagandistic approach of what the present owes the past, then you'll get yourself into the kind of problems that we've got ourselves into. So in a sense, I think that when we're teaching the large undergraduate classes that we have, we're in a sense involved in the project of public history, in taking history to the South African public and all of the diversity that we have. And what I'm trying to do, if the book achieves its optimal objectives by choosing the publisher that I've had, it's one of the aims to try and expand that conversation further. And if I'm lucky enough to achieve success with the book, that's what will be achieved.
Really fascinating, what you've been saying about your book. Unless there are any final questions or comments. Okay, so Patrick says, thank you, Professor, for the great presentation, and I look forward to reading your book. I think you've given all of us some fine festive season reading. It's very timely we had this talk, because finally, we might be able to set aside. Pardon me? Oh, who is it? Oh,
there was a hand up.
Oh, I thought it was someone clapping, but maybe I'm wrong. But I must say that I found your presentation so fascinating. The book, it seems like it's, your work is going in a really magisterial direction. And, I really found what you were saying very historiographically rich. You made a lot of important points about methodology and sources. And I think all of us really look forward to engaging with you further about your work, sort of staying in touch. I'm sure you're going to crack open a lot of really interesting debates in our discipline. And I think that I'd like to end by congratulating you very much. And please do present during our seminar series as well, our research seminar series in 2022, because I sense that you've barely scratched the surface in terms of, where your research is headed and that sort of thing. So I would like to congratulate you, and we all, those of us that haven't read the book, we very much look forward to doing so. So thank you so much. And yes, thanks once again, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing, Mandisa, and thank you for everybody for providing the audience. Thank you so much.